powerful mafia boss collides with a shy black waitress, and she lives rent-free in his thoughts. The rain drummed against the cracked window of the third-floor apartment like impatient fingers, each drop echoing the anxiety that had been building in Naomi Carter's chest for weeks. She stood at the small kitchen counter, counting crumpled bills for the third time, hoping somehow the numbers would magically change. $27.43. Not even enough for groceries, let alone the rent that was already 2 weeks overdue. The smell of burnt coffee filled the cramped space, mixing with the lingering scent of the cheap vanilla candle she'd lit to mask the mustiness that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Her waitressing uniform, a plain black dress that had seen better days, hung on the back of a chair, still damp from the evening shift at Rosie's diner. Her feet ached in a way that spoke of too many hours on worn-out shoes, but she couldn't afford new ones. Not yet. "Marcus?" she called softly, glancing toward the closed bedroom door. No response. Her younger brother had been avoiding her for days, slipping out early and returning after she'd fallen asleep from exhaustion. The pit in her stomach grew heavier. Something was wrong, more wrong than their usual struggles with bills and broken dreams. She moved toward his door, bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. "Marcus, we need to talk about." The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway outside made her freeze. Multiple sets of feet, moving with purpose. In their building, people either shuffled tiredly home from work or stumbled drunkenly up the stairs. These footsteps were different. Controlled. Deliberate. 3 sharp knocks shattered the silence. Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed her back against Marcus's door, as if she could somehow shield him from whatever waited on the other side. The knocking came again, harder this time, rattling the thin wood. "Open up." The voice was calm, almost polite, but it carried an undertone that made her blood run cold. "We know you're in there." Her hands trembled as she approached the front door. Through the peephole, she saw a wall of dark suits and broad shoulders. The man in front had silver-streaked hair and eyes like winter storms. Even through the distorted lens, she could see he wasn't someone you kept waiting. Who is it?" she managed, hating how her voice shook. "Vincenzo Moretti." The name hit her like a physical blow. She'd heard whispers about him in the diner, seen the way people's voices dropped to fearful murmurs when his name came up. The kind of man who owned half the city and ruled the other half through fear. "I'm here about your brother's debt." The world tilted beneath her feet. Marcus's debt. Of course. All those late nights, the nervous energy, the way he'd been avoiding her eyes. Her baby brother, the one she'd practically raised after their parents died, had gotten involved with people who didn't forgive or forget. "Marcus isn't here," she lied, pressing her forehead against the cool door. "Naomi Carter, age 24, works double shifts at Rosie's Diner on 5th Street. Your brother Marcus Carter, age 22, currently owes my organization $47,000. His voice never changed tone, as if he were reading grocery list items instead of destroying her life with each word. "Now you can open this door, or my associates can open it for you. But one way or another, we're having this conversation tonight." Her hands shook so violently she could barely turn the locks. She cracked the door open, the security chain still attached, and found herself staring into the most unsettling eyes she'd ever seen. They weren't cruel exactly, but they were calculating, measuring her like she was a problem to be solved. "Smart girl," he said, and somehow that simple praise felt more dangerous than a threat. The door splintered as one of his men shouldered it open, the security chain snapping like a toy. Naomi stumbled backward as 3 large men in expensive suits filled her tiny living room, making the space feel impossibly small. But it was the man in the center who commanded all the attention. Vincenzo Moretti moved like he owned every room he entered, his dark coat still beaded with rain, his presence sucking all the air from the apartment. "Mr. Moretti, please," she began, but he held up one perfectly manicured hand. "Where is he?" Before she could answer, Marcus's bedroom door creaked open. Her brother appeared, looking younger than his 22 years, his face pale and drawn. The confident boy she remembered had been replaced by someone hollow-eyed and desperate. "Vinny, I can explain." "Don't." Vincenzo's voice cut through Marcus's words like a blade. "You've had 3 months to explain. 3 months to pay. Instead, you've been avoiding my calls and hiding behind your sister." Naomi stepped between them without thinking, her body moving on instinct to protect Marcus the way she always had. "How much? How much does he owe?" Vincenzo's attention shifted to her, and she felt the full weight of his scrutiny. Up close, he was younger than she'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of sharp features that belonged on magazine covers rather than in her rundown apartment. But there was something predatory in the way he looked at her, as if he could see right through her brave front to the terrified girl beneath. 47,000. Plus interest. He paused, letting the number sink in. "Which brings us to an even 50. Naomi's knees nearly buckled. $50,000 might as well have been 50 million. She made maybe 25,000 a year if she was lucky, working herself to the bone for every penny. "I don't have that kind of money," Marcus whispered behind her. "I know." Vincenzo's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Which is why we're here to discuss alternative arrangements." One of his men, a mountain of a person with scarred knuckles, stepped forward. "Boss, you want me to?" "No need for that. Yet." Vincenzo never took his eyes off Naomi. "Your brother made a choice when he sat down at my poker table. Multiple choices, actually. Each one dumber than the last. Please." Naomi found her voice stronger than she felt. "There has to be something we can work out. A payment plan or..." "Your brother already had a payment plan. He missed every single deadline." Vincenzo circled her slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. "But I'm a reasonable man. I don't enjoy collecting from people who can't pay. Bad for business. So I'm prepared to make you an offer." The way he said offer made her skin crawl, but she lifted her chin anyway. "What kind of offer?" "You work for me. Exclusively. Until the debt is paid in full." The room went silent except for the rain still pounding against the windows. Marcus made a strangled sound behind her. "What kind of work?" she asked, though she was terrified of the answer. Something flickered in Vincenzo's eyes, surprise, maybe, or approval. "Not what you're thinking. I need someone I can trust at private gatherings. Someone who can serve drinks, handle delicate situations. Someone invisible. How long? Depends on how quickly you work off $50,000. Plus room and board." He named a weekly salary that was more than she made in a month at the diner. Naomi's mind raced. It was a trap, it had to be. Men like Vincenzo Moretti didn't make generous offers to people in her position. But looking at Marcus cowering behind her, seeing the way his hands shook, she realized she didn't have a choice. She'd been protecting him her whole life. She wasn't about to stop now. "And Marcus? What happens to him?" "Nothing, as long as you honor our agreement." Vincenzo extended his hand. "Do we have a deal, Miss Carter?" She stared at his hand for a long moment, knowing that shaking it would change everything. The safe, predictable misery of her current life would be replaced by something far more dangerous. But Marcus would be alive. That had to count for something. "I have conditions," she said, surprising herself with her steady voice. Vincenzo's eyebrows rose. "You're in no position to make demands. I am if you want me to work for you instead of simply taking whatever Marcus owes out of his skin." She met his gaze directly, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. "I keep my apartment. I visit my brother whenever I want. And when the debt is paid, I'm free to go. No extensions, no additional fees, no excuses." For a moment, she thought she saw something like respect flicker across his features. Then his expression hardened back into its usual mask of controlled menace. "Agreed." He extended his hand again. "Welcome to the family business, Miss Carter." As their hands touched, Naomi felt like she was falling into an abyss with no bottom in sight. His skin was surprisingly warm, his grip firm but not crushing. For just an instant, she could have sworn she saw something almost human in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold calculation she was already learning to fear. "Pack a bag," he said, releasing her hand. "You start tonight." And just like that, Naomi Carter's life as she knew it was over. The black sedan moved through the city like a shark cutting through dark water. Naomi pressed herself against the leather seat, clutching her small duffel bag like a lifeline. The men who flanked her on either side said nothing, their silence more unnerving than any threat. She caught glimpses of Vincenzo in the rearview mirror. He sat in the front passenger seat, speaking in low Italian to the driver, his voice a steady rumble that seemed to vibrate through her bones. They'd been driving for 20 minutes, leaving behind the familiar broken streetlights and boarded-up shops of her neighborhood for areas of the city she'd only seen in movies. Here, the buildings gleamed with fresh paint, the sidewalks were clean, and even the darkness seemed somehow more expensive. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Home," Vincenzo replied without turning around. The word carried weight she didn't understand yet. The car pulled through massive iron gates that opened like they recognized the vehicle. The mansion that emerged from the manicured darkness took her breath away. It was all sharp angles and floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of place that belonged on architectural magazine covers. Warm light spilled from dozens of windows, making it look almost welcoming despite its imposing size. "Jesus," she breathed, then immediately wished she'd kept quiet. One of Vincenzo's men, the scarred one from earlier, chuckled. "Wait till you see the inside, sweetheart." "Tony," Vincenzo's voice carried a warning that made the man's grin disappear instantly. Inside, the mansion was even more overwhelming. Marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers, and every surface seemed to cost more than she'd ever seen in her life. Original paintings hung on walls that stretched impossibly high, and furniture that looked like museum pieces was arranged with casual precision. "Mrs. Rodriguez will show you to your room," Vincenzo said, gesturing to a small, stern-looking woman who appeared as if summoned. "You'll have an hour to settle in. Then we begin." Naomi's room was larger than her entire apartment, complete with a four-poster bed draped in silk and a bathroom with more marble than a cemetery. A black dress hung in the closet, simple but clearly expensive, the kind of fabric that whispered when it moved. Beside it, a note in sharp handwriting, "Wear this." No jewelry except the earrings provided. Hair pulled back. VM. The earrings were small diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. As she fastened them, Naomi stared at her reflection and barely recognized herself. The dress fit perfectly, too perfectly. How had he known her size? Mrs. Rodriguez knocked precisely 1 hour later. "Time," she said in accented English, then led Naomi through a maze of corridors to a dining room that could have seated 30 people comfortably. But tonight, only 8 men occupied the massive table, their voices a low murmur of business talk peppered with words she didn't recognize. They all looked up when she entered, their conversations dying like someone had turned off a radio. "Gentlemen," Vincenzo rose from the head of the table, wine glass in hand. "Allow me to introduce Naomi. She'll be handling our service this evening." The men's eyes followed her with varying degrees of interest and amusement. One, a heavy-set man with gold teeth, let out a low whistle. "Vinny's got himself a new pet," he said, his voice thick with innuendo. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Vincenzo's smile never wavered, but something deadly flickered behind his eyes. "Naomi is an employee, Sal. Nothing more, nothing less. I trust that's understood?" The message was clear, and Sal's grin faded quickly. "Course, boss. Just having some fun. Have it elsewhere." Naomi moved through the evening like she was walking through a minefield. She served wine that cost more per bottle than she made in a week, cleared plates of food she couldn't even pronounce, and tried to become invisible the way Vincenzo had suggested. But she felt their eyes on her constantly, measuring, judging, waiting for her to make a mistake. The conversation flowed around her in a mixture of English and Italian, touching on subjects she tried not to understand. Numbers that seemed too large, names spoken like curses, plans that made her skin crawl. These weren't just businessmen in expensive suits. These were predators discussing prey. But as the evening wore on, something strange happened. Her initial terror began to fade, replaced by a kind of professional focus she recognized from her busiest nights at the diner. These men might be dangerous, but they were still just customers who wanted their glasses full and their plates cleared. The difference was the stakes, and the fact that the man watching her every move could probably have her finished with a phone call. Vincenzo barely acknowledged her presence, but she felt his attention like a physical weight. Whenever she moved through the room, his eyes followed. When she leaned across the table to pour wine, she caught him studying her with an expression she couldn't read. Near midnight, the dinner finally ended. The men filed out in expensive cars, their voices carrying threats disguised as pleasantries. Naomi began clearing the table with shaking hands, exhaustion finally catching up with her. "Leave it!" She turned to find Vincenzo watching her from the doorway, his tie loosened, his perfect hair slightly mussed. For the first time all evening, he looked almost human. "I said leave it. Mrs. Rodriguez will handle the rest. I don't mind. You did well tonight." The unexpected praise made her freeze with a wine glass halfway to her lips. "Better than I expected." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. Behind the calculated coldness, she caught a glimpse of what might have been surprise. Or maybe even approval. "What did you expect?" she asked before she could stop herself. A ghost of a smile crossed his features. Tears. Screaming. Maybe fainting when Sal made his comment. "I've dealt with worse than him at the diner." "I'm sure you have." He moved closer, and she caught a hint of expensive cologne mixed with something uniquely him. "But this isn't the diner, Naomi. The men who come to my table aren't just rude customers you can handle with a smile and a firm word. They're criminals. Thieves. Worse. And what does that make you?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. For a moment, she thought she'd gone too far. Then Vincenzo's smile widened, becoming something almost genuine. "Smart girl," he said, echoing his words from her apartment. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, we have a much more interesting crowd." As he walked away, Naomi realized with a chill that she was already looking forward to it. 3 weeks had passed since Naomi's first dinner service, and she'd begun to understand the rhythm of Vincenzo's world. Tuesday evenings were for the accountants, nervous men in cheap suits who spoke in whispers about money laundering and offshore accounts. Thursdays brought the muscle, scarred enforcers who ate like wolves and discussed territory disputes between courses. But Friday nights were different. Friday nights were when the real power players gathered. Naomi smoothed her black dress and checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. The routine had become second nature, hair pulled back in a perfect chignon, diamond earrings catching the light, posture straight but not challenging. Invisible until needed, present when required. The dining room buzzed with tension tonight. She could feel it the moment she entered with the first course, an undercurrent of hostility that made the air thick and dangerous. 2 men sat at opposite ends of the long table, their crews flanking them like armies preparing for battle. Dominic Castellano controlled the docks on the east side, his empire built on smuggled goods and union corruption. He was a large man with cold eyes and a reputation for settling disputes with bullets. Across from him sat Marco Benedetti, younger and hungrier, who'd been making moves on Castellano's territory for months. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. Vincenzo presided from the head of the table, but even he seemed tense tonight. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a negotiation with the potential to explode into violence. "The way I see it," Benedetti was saying as Naomi poured wine, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "Respect is earned, not inherited. Just because your old man ran those docks for 30 years doesn't mean you deserve them now." Castellano's jaw tightened. "My father built that operation from nothing. I've bled for those docks. Your father's been deceased for 5 years. Maybe it's time for new blood." The room went silent except for the soft clink of silverware against china. Naomi felt the shift in atmosphere like a change in air pressure before a storm. Hands moved subtly toward jacket pockets. Eyes hardened. Even the servers from the kitchen seemed to sense danger and retreated to the walls. "Careful, boy." Castellano's voice was a low growl. "You're talking about things you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Benedetti leaned forward, his smile turning predatory. "I understand that the old ways are dying. That men like you are dinosaurs waiting for extinction." The insult hit like a physical blow. Castellano's face flushed deep red, and his hand moved toward his waistband. His men shifted in their seats, reading the signal. Across the table, Benedetti's crew mirrored the movement. Naomi saw it happening in slow motion, the drawing of lines that couldn't be uncrossed, the escalation that would turn Vincenzo's dining room into a battle zone. Blood on marble floors, broken crystal, bodies in expensive suits. She thought of Marcus, safe in their apartment because she was here, in this moment, watching everything fall apart. Without thinking, she stepped forward into the space between the two factions, her serving tray balanced perfectly in one hand. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the tension. "I believe you're both right." Every eye in the room turned to her. She felt Vincenzo's sharp attention like a spotlight, but she kept her focus on the two men who looked ready to finish each other. "Mr. Castellano," she continued, setting down a fresh glass of wine in front of him. "Your father's legacy is impressive. 30 years of steady growth, loyal workers, minimal law enforcement interference. That kind of foundation doesn't happen by accident." Castellano blinked, surprised by the unexpected praise. "And Mr. Benedetti." She moved to his end of the table, her movements graceful and unhurried. "Your innovations in the southern districts have been remarkable. Increasing profits by 40% in just 2 years? That takes vision." She straightened, addressing the room as if she were mediating a business meeting instead of preventing a massacre. "The question isn't whether the old ways are better than new ones, or whether experience trumps innovation. The question is whether two successful operations might be even more successful working together rather than destroying each other." The silence stretched like a held breath. Then Benedetti let out a surprised laugh. "The waitress is giving us business advice?" But his hand had moved away from his gun, and his smile was more genuine now. Across the table, Castellano's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Smart waitress," he rumbled, echoing words Naomi had heard before. "Maybe we should listen." What followed wasn't exactly peace, but it wasn't battle either. The conversation shifted from threats to possibilities, from territory disputes to potential partnerships. Both men seemed almost relieved to step back from the brink, as if they'd been looking for an excuse to avoid bloodshed. As the evening wound down and the potential combatants left in separate cars but without casualties, Naomi found herself alone in the dining room with Vincenzo. He stood by the windows, looking out at the city lights, a brandy snifter in his hand. "That was either very brave or very stupid," he said without turning around. "Probably both." He turned then, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You realize you just prevented what could have been a very messy battle?" "I realize I probably overstepped my bounds." "You did." He moved closer, and she caught that familiar scent of expensive cologne, and something uniquely him. "Employees don't typically mediate disputes between capos. Should I apologize? For preventing a bloodbath in my dining room? Hardly." His smile was different now, not the predatory grin she'd grown accustomed to, but something warmer. More real. "I'm just trying to figure out how a waitress from the South Side learned to read a room better than men who've been in this business their whole lives." "Survival," she said simply. "You learn to spot trouble before it finds you." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, maybe, or understanding. For a moment, the careful distance he maintained seemed to waver. "Indeed," he said quietly. "Get some rest, Naomi. Tomorrow's dinner might be even more interesting." As she walked away, Naomi felt his eyes following her, and she knew something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer just the waitress working off her brother's debt. She'd become something else entirely, though what that meant, she was afraid to discover. The first time Vincenzo sought her out, Naomi convinced herself it was coincidence. She was in the mansion's library, a room she'd discovered during her third week, filled with leather-bound books that probably cost more than her yearly salary. She'd been drawn to a collection of poetry, running her fingers along the spines when his voice made her jump. "You read Neruda?" She spun around to find him standing in the doorway, no longer in his usual tailored suit but wearing dark jeans and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He looked younger this way, more human, though no less dangerous. I'm sorry. I didn't think anyone would mind if I..." "Relax." He stepped into the room, moving with that predatory grace she'd grown familiar with. "I'm curious about your taste in literature, not angry about your presence." He'd crept up her neck. "I studied comparative literature in college. Before." She gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had led her to this moment. "Before you had to drop out to take care of Marcus." The fact that he knew this shouldn't have surprised her. Vincenzo Moretti probably knew her social security number and blood type, but it still made her uncomfortable. "What do you think of his work?" He nodded toward the Neruda collection. "Beautiful. Passionate. Sometimes heartbreaking." She paused, studying his face for any sign of mockery. Finding none, she continued. "He writes about love like it's both salvation and destruction." Something flickered in his dark eyes. An apt description. The second time felt less like coincidence. Naomi was in the kitchen early one morning, making coffee before the household staff arrived. She preferred these quiet moments before the day's chaos began, when she could almost pretend this was a normal life. "You're up early." She didn't jump this time, though her pulse still quickened at the sound of his voice. "Couldn't sleep." Vincenzo moved to the expensive espresso machine, his movements efficient and practiced. "Nightmares?" "Sometimes." She watched him work, surprised by how domestic he looked despite the obvious wealth surrounding them. "What's your excuse?" "I don't sleep much. Haven't for years." He handed her a perfect cup of espresso, their fingers brushing as she took it. "The mind of a man in my position is rarely quiet." "Guilt?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, but instead of anger, she saw something like amusement in his expression. "Among other things." He leaned against the marble counter, studying her over his own cup. "What did you want to be?" "Before circumstances intervened." "A teacher." "High school English." The admission felt strange on her tongue. She hadn't spoken about her abandoned dreams in years. "I wanted to show kids that books could be doorways to different worlds. And now you're living in a different world than you ever imagined." "Not by choice. Few of us choose our circumstances, Naomi. We simply adapt to them." By the third week of these encounters, his men had begun to notice. She caught Tony whispering urgently to another enforcer, their eyes darting between her and Vincenzo's office. The words were Italian, but the meaning was clear enough. The boss was distracted, and that made everyone nervous. "He's asking too many questions." She overheard Sal tell another capo during dinner service. "Wanting to know what she thinks about expansion into the waterfront, about the Benedetti situation. Since when does Vincenzo Moretti ask a waitress for strategic advice?" The criticism stung, partly because it held a grain of truth. Their conversations had evolved beyond small talk about books and coffee. He'd begun asking her opinion on business matters, carefully, obliquely, but genuinely seeking her perspective. When she'd suggested a particular approach to the dock workers' union, he'd listened. When she'd pointed out a flaw in a proposed money laundering scheme, he'd reconsidered the entire operation. "She's a distraction," Tony said bluntly during what he thought was a private conversation in the garage. "Boss needs to remember what she is, collateral on a debt, nothing more." But Naomi was beginning to suspect Vincenzo was having the same problem she was, forgetting what this arrangement was supposed to be. It became obvious the night he found her crying. She'd been trying so hard to maintain her composure, to be the perfect invisible employee who caused no problems and attracted no attention. But the call from Marcus had shattered her careful control. He'd been drinking, she could hear it in his slurred words, and the guilt was eating him alive. "I ruined your life, Naomi." You're trapped because of me, because I'm a screw-up who can't do anything right. She tried to reassure him, to tell him she was fine, that this was temporary. But after she'd hung up, the weight of it all came crashing down. The loneliness, the fear, the strange pull she felt toward a man who could destroy her with a word, it was too much. Vincenzo found her in the garden, sitting on a stone bench with tears streaming down her face. For a moment, he just stood there, and she waited for him to walk away or call someone to deal with the emotional employee. Instead, he sat beside her. "Marcus?" he asked quietly. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "He blames himself. He should. This is his fault." The words came out harsher than she intended. "And yet you're here instead of him. Someone has to protect him. I've been doing it his whole life." Vincenzo was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Who protects you, Naomi?" The question broke something inside her chest. "I protect myself. That's a lonely way to live." She turned to look at him then, really look at him, and saw something vulnerable in his expression that made her breath catch. "Isn't that how you live?" His smile was rueful. "Touché." They sat in silence as the night air carried the scent of jasmine and distant city sounds. When he finally spoke again, it was almost too quiet to hear. "This wasn't supposed to happen." She knew he wasn't talking about her crying. "What wasn't?" But he was already standing, the moment of vulnerability closed off behind his usual mask of controlled power. "Get some rest," he said, back to being the untouchable Mafia boss. But as he walked away, she saw him run a hand through his hair in what looked suspiciously like frustration. Naomi remained on the bench long after he'd gone, her tears dried but her heart racing with the dangerous realization that she was falling for a man who could never truly be hers. The black SUV came out of nowhere. Naomi had been walking back from visiting Marcus, her first time leaving the mansion grounds in over a month. Vincenzo had finally agreed to let her go alone after weeks of her insisting she needed to check on her brother. The visit had been tense. Marcus was clean but hollow-eyed, working double shifts at a warehouse job to stay busy and avoid old temptations. He'd hugged her goodbye like he might never see her again. She was 3 blocks from the mansion when the vehicle jumped the curb. The sound of squealing tires made her look up from her phone just as the SUV's doors burst open. 3 men in dark clothing moved toward her with military precision, their faces covered by bandanas. Naomi's scream caught in her throat as recognition hit. These weren't random attackers. They moved too purposefully, knew exactly who they were targeting. "Vincenzo's little pet," one of them said, his voice carrying a thick Brooklyn accent. "You're coming with us." Training from self-defense classes she'd taken years ago kicked in. Instead of running, which would have been useless in heels, she swung her purse like a weapon, catching the nearest man across the face. Her keys, held between her fingers like claws, raked across another attacker's cheek. But there were 3 of them, and they were professionals. Strong hands grabbed her arms, lifting her off the ground despite her struggles. A cloth pressed against her nose and mouth, and the world began to blur around the edges. Her last coherent thought was that Vincenzo had been right. She should never have left the mansion alone. She woke up in what looked like an abandoned warehouse, her wrists zip-tied to a metal chair. The taste in her mouth was bitter, chemical, and her head pounded like someone was using her skull for drum practice. Dim light filtered through grimy windows, and the air smelled of rust and decay. "Good, you're awake." A man stepped out of the shadows, mid-40s, expensive suit incongruous in the decrepit surroundings, with the kind of cold eyes she'd learned to recognize in Vincenzo's world. "I was beginning to worry we'd used too much chloroform." "Who are you?" Her voice came out as a croak. "Angelo Torino. I believe you've heard my name." She had. Torino ran numbers and protection rackets in Queens, and according to dinner conversation she'd overheard, he'd been trying to muscle in on Vincenzo's territory for months. More importantly, he was known for his complete lack of mercy. "What do you want?" "To send a message." Torino pulled up another chair, sitting close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something that might have been fierce sweat. See, your boss has been very difficult to negotiate with lately. Unreasonable, you might say. But I've noticed he's developed a soft spot. The implication hit her like ice water. I'm nobody. Just an employee. Just an employee? Torino's laugh was ugly. Vincenzo Moretti doesn't ask just employees for their opinions on territorial disputes. He doesn't have his men drive just employees to visit their junkie brothers. And he certainly doesn't look at just employees the way he looks at you. Fear crawled up her spine, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. You're wrong. Am I? Then he won't mind if I send you back to him piece by piece. The warehouse door exploded inward with a sound like thunder. Vincenzo stood in the doorway backlit by car headlights, and for a moment he looked like an avenging angel carved from shadow and fury. He wasn't alone. Tony and 4 other men flanked him, all armed, all moving with deadly purpose. Angelo. Vincenzo's voice carried across the warehouse like a blade. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Moretti! Torino jumped to his feet, pulling a gun from his jacket. Right on time. We were just getting acquainted. Let her go, and I might let you live. The warehouse erupted in gunfire. Naomi threw herself sideways as bullets sparked off metal and concrete around her. The zip ties cut into her wrists as she struggled to get low, to make herself as small a target as possible. Shouts and curses echoed through the space in both English and Italian. Through the chaos, she saw Vincenzo moving like violence personified, controlled, efficient, lethal. This wasn't the man who'd asked her about poetry or found her crying in the garden. This was the predator everyone feared, and watching him work was both terrifying and mesmerizing. The gunfight lasted maybe 2 minutes, though it felt like hours. When the smoke cleared, Torino lay motionless near the far wall, and his men were either deceased or fled. Vincenzo appeared beside her chair, his dark suit torn and a thin line of blood on his cheek. Are you hurt? His hands shook slightly as he cut her restraints. No, I don't think. The words died as she looked into his eyes. The cold calculation was gone, replaced by something raw and desperate that made her breath catch. When I got the call that you'd been taken. He pulled her to her feet, his hands lingering on her arms as if reassuring himself she was real. I've never felt fear like that. Not in 20 years of this business. The admission hung between them like a confession. Around them, his men were securing the warehouse, checking bodies, but Vincenzo's attention was entirely focused on her. Why? She whispered. Why does it matter so much? For a moment, she thought he might answer. Then his mask slammed back into place, the vulnerable man disappearing behind the untouchable boss. Because you're under my protection, he said, but they both knew that wasn't the whole truth. As they left the warehouse, Naomi realized that everything had changed. She was no longer just collateral on a debt or even a valued employee. She'd become Vincenzo Moretti's weakness, and in his world, that made her the most dangerous person alive. The question was whether either of them would survive it. 3 months later, Naomi stood in Vincenzo's office holding a piece of paper that should have meant freedom. The final payment receipt, Marcus's debt, paid in full with interest. $50,000 of her life, measured in elegant dinners and dangerous men, in late-night conversations and moments that had rewired her understanding of herself. It's done, Vincenzo said from behind his massive desk, but he didn't sound triumphant. If anything, he sounded hollow. Your brother's debt is cleared. Your obligation to my organization is complete. She studied the document, the official letterhead and careful legal language that reduced months of her life to a business transaction. Just like that? Just like that. He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the city. Even with his back to her, she could see the tension in his shoulders. Mrs. Rodriguez has prepared your final payment. There's also a bonus for exceptional service. The clinical tone was back, the voice he used for business meetings and territory negotiations. As if the man who'd held her against his chest after the warehouse, who'd whispered her name like a prayer while checking for injuries, had never existed. A bonus. She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. How generous. Naomi. No. She crumpled the receipt in her fist. Don't. Whatever speech you've prepared about this being for the best, just don't. He turned then, and she saw her own pain reflected in his dark eyes. The past 3 months had changed him too. The untouchable Mafia boss who'd stormed into her apartment had developed laugh lines from their conversations, worry lines from the nights he'd sat vigil outside her room after the kidnapping, afraid to leave her unprotected even in his own home. This is what we agreed on, he said quietly. You work until the debt is paid, then you're free to go. Free. The word tasted like ashes. Back to my one-room apartment and 12-hour shifts at the diner. Back to worrying about rent and groceries and whether Marcus will fall off the wagon again. You'll have enough money to. I don't want your money, Vincenzo. The use of his first name made him flinch. In public, she still called him Mr. Moretti, maintaining the fiction that she was just an employee. But in private moments like this, the walls between them had crumbled long ago. I want you to tell me why you're sending me away. Because it's what's best for you. That's not your decision to make. Isn't it? His voice hardened, but she could see the pain underneath. Did you forget what happened in that warehouse? Torino took you because of me. Because you'd become a target just by being near me. And you saved me. This time. What about next time? What happens when it's someone smarter than Angelo Torino, someone who doesn't give me a chance to find you before? He cut himself off, but the unfinished threat hung in the air between them. Naomi moved closer, close enough to see the exhaustion in his face, the weight of constant vigilance that came with his world. What if I don't want to be saved? What if I want to choose my own risks? You don't understand what you're asking. I understand perfectly. I'm asking you to stop deciding my life for me. She reached up to touch his face, and he leaned into the contact despite himself. I'm asking you to tell me what I already know you feel. For a moment, his mask slipped completely. She saw the man beneath the monster, lonely, burdened, desperate for something real in a world built on lies and violence. I can't give you a normal life, he whispered. I haven't had a normal life since I was 15 and our parents died. Normal is overrated. I could get you finished. You could get hit by a bus tomorrow. Life doesn't come with guarantees. His laugh was bitter. You're comparing the Mafia to traffic accidents? I'm saying that love is always a risk. The word hung between them, finally spoken aloud. The question is whether you think I'm worth it. He pulled her against him then, his arms wrapping around her like he could shield her from the world through sheer force of will. You're worth everything, he said against her hair. That's the problem. Then stop trying to solve it. She pulled back to meet his eyes. Stop trying to protect me from my own choices. And if something happens to you because of me, then we'll face it together. The way we should have been doing all along. For a long moment, they stood frozen in the space between what was safe and what was true. Then Vincenzo's careful control finally shattered. God help us both, he breathed, and kissed her like she was salvation and damnation wrapped in one perfect package. When they broke apart, the receipt lay forgotten on the floor, the debt officially paid but their story just beginning. Because some contracts, Naomi thought as she lost herself in his embrace, were written in something stronger than ink and paper. They were written in the heart, and those debts were never truly settled, only transformed into something worth everything.